A combination of spending cuts and tax hikes in the US taking effect as of the 1st of January 2013 has already got experts predicting they could be the next biggest drag on the global economy. It's known as the fiscal cliff. Joining me now on the phone to discuss this in more detail is Managing Director Benjamin Tal from CIBC in Toronto. Benjamin, for those viewers that aren't so familiar with the term, perhaps you could briefly talk me through this looming fiscal cliff facing the US economy.
Well, we all know that the recovery in the US economy was not a real recovery. It was a recovery that was basically based on fiscal stimulus. Obama was spending close to $1.7 trillion in budget deficits in order to stimulate the economy, tax cuts, the increase in transfer payments. We know the story. This kind of stimulus led to the economy out from a recession into more or less economic growth of about 2 to 2.5%. We know, however, that come 2013, next year, regardless who wins the elections in November, this fiscal stimulus cannot continue. We are going to see spending being frozen, and we can see actually a situation in which all those tax cuts will not be extended. Just those two measures will have a significant negative impact on GDP growth, economic growth in 2013. We estimate between 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP negative, namely those kind of measures will have a negative impact of 2 to 3 percentage points on overall economic growth. So this is the fiscal cliff that everybody's talking about it. And the key question is to what extent the private sector is ready to take over from the public sector. And that's a big question. It's an open question.
Is that a question you can perhaps answer yourself, or does it remain a question mark?
Well, there are two candidates to replace the fiscal situation. One is the consumer, the other is the manufacturing sector, the business sector.
Now, there are a range of potential outcomes. If we look at the best and worst case scenarios, either Congress do nothing or somehow delay these Bush-era tax cuts and delay most of the spending cuts past 2013. Given what's at stake, what steps do you see as being the most likely to be taken by lawmakers?
Well, I do think that they will go ahead with some sort of fiscal drag. I think that it will not be responsible to just let things go the way they are. However, as I said, the estimates are between 2 to 3 percentage points. If we wake up at 2013 and we see a situation in which the consumer is not ready and business investment is not rising as rapidly as before because of the fact that the global economy is slowing, then they basically will not cut as significantly. So this is a moving target, if you wish. It's a very, very flexible target, and it will be determined by the ability of the consumer to take over the government. So I suggest that regardless how you look at it, we are going to get roughly 2% GDP growth in the U.S. in 2013. The more interesting story will be the composition of this growth, how much government and how much private. And I suggest that you will see the private sector surprising on the upside, especially the consumer, helped by the reintroduction of credit and debt into the system. So I will not be surprised if Congress will be able to cut, or at least not to extend, those tax cuts, and the spending that they're talking about will not be introduced the way people think they might. So I think that actually the private sector will be able to offset some of the negative that will be coming from the government.
So you believe a lot of uncertainty remains until the US presidential elections are over in November?
Absolutely. I think that we have to go through the election first because nobody knows exactly what will be the fiscal situation or the agenda, the fiscal agenda after the election. So we have to wait until we have a budget and elections. After that, the magnitude of the fiscal drag will be determined by the private sector and how quickly this private sector is able to recover. Now, this private sector will be able to recover depends on what's happening globally in China and Europe and other areas of the world, and of course what Bernanke will do with interest rates or maybe quantitative easing. So many uncertainties. Clearly what's happening in the global economies impact the psyche of the U.S. economy, and that's not going to change after the elections.
What about the Fed's potential response to this dilemma?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Fed is telling us that they're not going to raise interest rates until 2014, and I believe that they're actually going to stick to this policy. The big question is, of course, is to what extent they are going to reintroduce a QE3 or a twist 2, if you wish. And I suggest that we have two scenarios coming. One is that we will get some good news coming from the U.S., and therefore there will not be any reason to do quantitative easing. But my belief at this point is that there is no need for that. I think that they can do other things like introducing what we call twist 2, basically extend the terms of interest rates as opposed to actually injecting or printing money. And any measure by the Fed will be positive for sentiment and the stock market. We've seen it before.
Benjamin, thank you very much for speaking to me this afternoon. It was a pleasure. Now, there is plenty to check out on Dukers Copy TV today, so make sure you stay tuned. But for the moment, goodbye.